Talking points. Right, here we go. Nice one to kick off with. 3-year-olds this season. Well, where are they all, Lee Mottershead?
Well, they're doing rather well in some divisions and not in others. So we had a King George in which, thankfully, we had 3-year-old participation because that always enhances the King George. Anthony van Dijk clearly didn't run his race. Norway, his stable companion, was the only other 3-year-old in the race. He actually ran a fair race, finished mid-division. In the Eclipse, Telecaster was well beaten. On the other side, you look at the July Cup, and there were 12 runners, 5 3-year-olds, and they finished 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th and 5th. So we're always in that period now where we do get these clashes. We've got the Sussex Stakes next week, when we'll see how Too Darn Hot and Circus Maximus compare to the older milers, who aren't a particularly good bunch anyway, so you'd be disappointed if they couldn't put it up to them. But certainly over middle distances, it does appear that the older horses are holding sway, and it also underlines the great benefit to the sport when these horses stay in training, because without the likes of Enable and Crystal Ocean and Wild Geist this year, some of those middle distance contests will be looking pretty weak. It
would be thin gruel. So, Kitty, who is going to end up being the top-rated 3-year-old this year? Is it going to be a 10 Sovereigns, a Too Darn Hot, a King of Comedy? What's your hunch?
I thought 10 Sovereigns was very impressive in the July Cup, so he'd definitely be in with a shout. King of Comedies really interests me. I saw him on his debut at Sandown, and he actually beat Phoenix of Spain into 4th there, and obviously Phoenix of Spain has gone on to achieve what he's done, so I'd be really interested in King of Comedy. It's a shame he's not going for the Sussex Stakes, but I guess when you've got the firepower John Gosden's got, you've got to split them up, you've got to please the owners. So I'd be interested in one of those two, I think, as leading 3-year-olds.
And the bell will go, but I will just defy the orders of this programme briefly, Jim, because there's a horse called Mahatha that everyone's forgotten about, trained by Marcus Tregoning, and, well, he could yet be the best 3-year-old.
Oh, it would be nice. Obviously, he had the injury after the Greenham, and hopefully be back at the end of the season.
Did he give you a good feel?
Gave me a very good feel, and it's such a shame. Marcus prepared the horse beautifully, and it would have been a real nice touch for him to have got another good one.
I'll let you hold the ball as we move on and talk about the Fillies Allowance, the sex allowance in Group 1 races. Should it be done away with, given what we've been hearing earlier on in the programme?
It's a tough one. I think it certainly favours the 3-year-old fillies. If you've got a big, strong 3-year-old filly, and you've only got to look at the Arc de Triomphe over the years, with Zarkava and Trev, Enable. You know, it's a massive thing for a filly to get that much amount of weight off a 4-year-old colt. It's hard to beat them.
The data tells you, Kitty, that it's just not really fair at the top level.
Yeah.
So why do we have it, do you think?
Well, I guess you're looking at Enable, like she got the allowance when she was 3, but she's the exception rather than the norm. She's a brilliant filly. She's done everything supremely well, but there are other fillies, I guess, who would benefit from that, as it's sort of, they're obviously not quite like her. But I think it's quite important to keep it, but it'd be interesting to see what would happen without it.
To keep it, to encourage that the participation of fillies in top-class races. I mean, in this country, it's the norm. In America, for example, it's not the norm for fillies to race against colts.
No, I mean, as you go through the American year now, you'd love to see the best fillies and mares taking part in the British Cup Classic, for example, which you do get the Zenyatas that do that.
The odd one, yeah.
Yeah, but generally they're heading towards the distaff because that's their programme. I mean, it's there for the greater good as well, in the sense, I think, if you look across the two sexes, that generally people would say that on the whole, the physical attributes of the fillies and mares relative to the colts and geldings put them at a disadvantage. It's when you get to the top of the pyramid there's a problem. And you also have this strange contradiction of, you know, when every year when we get to the end of year rankings that the Longines do, where we see the table of the best horses, that sex allowance isn't built into those numbers. So it's a very difficult, a bit like weight for age. You're always going to have debates about it. And when you have an Enable or an Annie Power type horse over jumps, you have the same debate.
We talk about integrity education. The BHA's been on the front foot this week, releasing a series of videos which will help young riders and licensed personnel and those who work in racing just to warn them of some of the dangers that could be out there in terms of their livelihoods and their licences. This has got to be a good idea, hasn't it, Jim? Because there's all sorts of pitfalls that you can fall into without realising it.
For sure. I mean, look, when you've got to be so careful nowadays, because wherever you go as a jockey, you'll get asked for a tip somewhere, whether it's somebody coming around to, paint your house or say, oh, what would you fancy today? Will you have a winner? And especially now Betfair came in, and you just don't know who you're talking to sometimes, and you've got to be so careful. And especially young lads working in racing, where somebody might approach them and ask them about horses if they're working in a big yard and things like that. And I think it's a good idea that people are being made aware of what you can and can't do and what you can and can't say. It's a positive thing, I think.
And also, even if someone is in a bar and buys you a drink, you've no idea who they are, and essentially they bought you, not them bought you, but you know what I mean, they've potentially bought something off you with that gift.
Exactly, and like I said, wherever you, even walking out yesterday at Ascot, you'd have people leaning over the rails. Do you fancy this? Do you think it'll win? Do you think it'll win? And you've got to be so careful, and you just have to say yes. I think everything will win.
It's been quite a front foot week for the BHA, hasn't it? Quite a proactive week in terms of getting messaging out.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think they have to be applauded on this one. The videos that go with them, in which your part is very well played. They're clear, they're concise.
I'm not playing a part.
No. You're presenting them. You're and
suggesting I'm acting.
No, they're done very well. They're done very well, and I think. It's interesting too, because I think in some ways similar to the bloodstock review that's been going on, there's a danger that in racing and in bloodstock we live within this little bubble and we have our own views about what's right and what's wrong, and sometimes we forget what people outside of that bubble might think. And I think here these videos are very good for saying, well, listen, within the racing community this might be deemed to be correct, but if you look at the bigger picture, perhaps when you're talking to this person saying this, you're not doing the right thing.
Have you got a tip for us?
I'm a terrible tipster.
What about the Arabians this afternoon?
Do you know what? If I ride a winner, I will be delighted, because I think I haven't ridden a winner on the Arabian Day yet. Hasn't
Briley
quite.
Frost on all the good ones, isn't she?
I think so.
Yeah. get Jim's laid. Heat. There's a joke, obviously. Heat this week. It has been very hot. It got up to 37 degrees, 38 degrees in the southeast on Thursday. We raced at Sandown, we raced at Newbury. Southall raced 5 races, called off the last 2. Generally speaking, Kitty, how well was the heat situation managed, do you think? There was a bit of... BHA took a little bit of heat, no pun intended, for racing at Southall and then calling off the last 2.
I think everyone did the best job they could. I mean, no one could foresee how hot the temperature would get. I mean, obviously there were forecasts, but just I was watching on the screen at the office, and they were explaining all the pre-measures they had for everything for the horses. They had this shelter underneath so they could go in and cool off more efficiently. I'm not so sure about jump racing in the summer. That sounds controversial, but just whether horses are actually used to that heat and whether they can adapt to it that quickly. But I'm sure there's some scientific statistics out there that can sort of show us a bit more in that regard.
Yeah, I think there wasn't really an issue with the flat racing. I think Kitty raised an interesting point about jumping in high temperatures, Jim, and you've had experience of both.
Yeah, I'd agree with you to a certain extent. I think obviously the flat racing, they're racing for a minute to 2 minutes, and I think when you're going 3.5 miles with 11.5 stone on your back in extreme heat is not ideal. All the tracks were very good this week. I rode out of, as soon as you came in, you were at Newbury the other night. We didn't ride them into the winners' enclosure. We got off them immediately, walking down the chute, buckets of water straight over them. I think I've ridden in countries where are hotter, but the horses are used to it. And when you get a heat wave come straight in like this, the horses aren't used to it, and sometimes they can struggle a little bit.
Generally well managed, Lee, do you think, this week?
Yeah, I think it was very well managed. My greater concern wouldn't be so much racing the horses, it would be travelling the horses. You had Southwell that finished at 2 o'clock, 2:30, which in theory looks a very good idea, but when you have that, it meant that the horses would have been travelling in the very hottest part of the day, between 3 and 5, and that for me would be the bigger concern.
Okay, I don't think we're going to get that sort of heat replicated this summer, I don't think. We'll move on to the Curragh. And this week it was announced that Pat Keogh will take over as CEO of the Curragh, in addition to his role at Leopardstown, a man that we know well.
Yeah.
Lee, and I think it's generally been well received, this appointment, that he will take responsibility for both tracks for the time being. That will help with Irish Champions weekend for sure.
It will. It's just about the first bit of good news the Curragh has received in a long time in terms of PR. For years now, the Curragh has been a really troubled racecourse in terms of how it's perceived by the public and by the wider sport. For years, people said the Curragh's facilities were terrible, which they were for a major racecourse, and it got criticised for that. Then the Curragh was criticised for continuing to race while in a period of major redevelopment, when perhaps the Irish Derby should have gone to Leopardstown, so there's criticism there. And then the Curragh has reopened. I've got to say, I've not been there yet, but the facilities sound spectacular. But the Curragh has been criticised for how those facilities treat general racegoers relative to racing professionals and those who can afford to pay the most. So in bringing in Pat Keogh to replace a chief executive who has left in pretty rapid circumstances and is now on gardening leave, seems like a very good idea. He's a good operator. He has a big job to do, particularly when you look at Irish Oaks Day, had an attendance of only just over 4,000 people, which seems, and almost certainly is, pitiful.
Kitty?
Yeah, I'd agree with Lee. I mean, something needs to happen. I think Pat's a good man to sort of take the step up. Just the crowd attendances, that's a worry, and that's something that needs addressing. Just 4,000. I mean, if you compare that to King George Day at Ascot, obviously different tracks, but it's just a concern.
It also reflects the fact as well that despite having the most powerful racing and breeding operations in the world of horse racing, Ireland is not a country that is particularly interested in flat racing. It's a jump racing nation, and flat racing continues to struggle there.
Which is quite extraordinary when you think about its status as a power base.
Absolutely.
And where do all these great thoroughbreds come from in the main as well. Nigel Adams is the new sports minister, taking over from Mims Davis, whose tenure was brief, but we've got a new government, and therefore there's been, well, it's not a reshuffle, there was a night of the long knives. And Nigel Adams is the man who's come in as Minister for Sport. Now, a senior Labour MP who is a big racing supporter has contacted me this week to say that he feels that this is good news for racing. So that, for me, will do. If a member of the opposition benches thinks that Nigel Adams is a good appointment for racing, then let's hope that's the case. But there have been several appointments in the new government, Lee, that could be good for racing, but at least there are racing-friendly people around. Yeah,
it's certainly a government, and it's actually a cabinet now as well, that has an awful lot of racing fans and people in there with an interest in racing. The sports minister, the new sports minister, the third new sports minister in 9 months, isn't someone I know or knew much of, but Nick Rust welcomed his appointment, spoken with someone with a real interest in horse racing. Matt Hancock, who of course stood briefly for the Conservative leadership, is still there as the Health Secretary and a big fan of Boris Johnson.
Yeah, he's a huge fan of Boris Johnson. He was such a huge fan, he just about managed to keep the same job.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got Priti Patel in the Home Office. Not an entirely uncontroversial figure herself, but someone who has a big interest in horse racing. You've got Rishi Sunak, who represents the constituency that includes Midland in the cabinet. So you've got the guys who have Midland and Newmarket as their constituencies in the cabinet. You've got racing fans in the cabinet as well, which must be a good thing, particularly when you balance that by the fact that in his great address, I say great address in terms of its length, in Downing Street, Boris Johnson spoke of the importance of animal welfare to his government. And that was it wasn't the sort of thing you would expect to hear a new Prime Minister saying in his first major address.
It
which
ticked
Nick
the possible vote winner box, didn't it?
And we have to bear in mind that with horse racing and with the way this government and the previous government adapted their approach to gambling, that tick the vote box is something that will be constantly on their minds.
Next and final point, an announcement this week of the Saudi Cup, now going to be the world's most valuable horse race, in the same sort of congested space for these big dirt races as the Pegasus World Cup in Florida and the Dubai World Cup. So it sits in between the two of them. Can this be a major part of the international racing stage in that part of the year?
They will offer the money, the money's clearly there. It's a project that seems to have taken a while to come to fruition. It's in quite a heavily populated part of the year, in the sense that you've got the Pegasus World Cup and the Dubai World Cup and now this contest. You can argue that in terms of European participation from our part of the world, even Dubai struggles to get the very best horses because it's a long year and they're campaigned increasingly with the autumn in mind. So Americans will be interested in it. It's not something that excites me, and it's not something that I will be rushing to attend, but it's an interesting addition to the calendar.
Especially given that it clashes with that 3-mile chase at Kempton on the same...
would hold far greater interest.
On the same weekend that used to be called the Racing Post Chase. Kitty, is it something that you're interested in?
It's an interesting idea. I mean, as Lee said, whether it will attract a huge number of Irish and sort of English competitors, that's another question. But it could set up like a nice bonus if someone went from the Pegasus to Riyadh and then the Dubai World Cup. But
yeah, you wouldn't mind owning a horse who could win all three, would you?
Yeah, you'd be pretty well off. But I'm just not sure about the timing and sort of just for European challenges at this stage.
Jim, have you ridden the dirt track in Riyadh?
No, I've never been there actually. No.
What's your sort of feel about another race to add to the sort of international program?
I'm not sure it's necessarily really needed, but if you put the money on, I'm sure people will come. But like I said, you've got the Dubai World Cup and the Pegasus World Cup. I'm not sure how many Europeans presence will be felt there really.
But if the phone rings for Jay Crowley,
I'll be there.
£20 million purse or dollar purse,
That's
he'll be
it.
there. Those were this week's talking points.